Welcome, Gunrunner.
The Nintendo Game Boy might not have been the very first handheld console. That achievement is awarded to the NB Microvision from 1979, but is certainly the most influential. This was the system that made handheld console gaming the hottest new thing, and inspired lots of companies to come up with their own in competition. Yet despite the arrival of the 16-bit Atari Lynx, and Sega's portable version of their best-selling Master System console, the Game Gear, the Game Boy managed to reign supreme, selling close to 120 million units worldwide. The reason for this success was a combination of the small form factor, long battery life, and an outstanding library containing many true classics. The machine continued to sell until 1998, when it was finally replaced by the backwards compatible Game Boy Color. Some people wonder why it took Nintendo so long to replace it, but as the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and you'll rarely find a broken Game Boy. But when you have a system that's as hugely successful as the Game Boy was, you also have an absolutely huge library of games to choose from, which would usually make picking a list of just 10 titles incredibly difficult. So you might be surprised to learn that I found putting this particular list together pretty easy. I think it's because that, although I never owned a Game Boy myself back in the day, my younger brother did, and managed to accrue a pretty substantial stack of games, which I have great memories of playing. So the vast majority of these titles were ones I played back in the day, and still play in the current day on my own Game Boy or via emulation. Classics that truly hold up and give just a small glimpse at what the handheld had to offer.
They said it wasn't humanly possible. All the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Game Boy comes complete with batteries and the outrageous new game Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use Video Link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
On Nintendo's 8-bit home console, infamous publisher LJN became renowned for producing a seemingly endless stream of abysmal games, based on licensed properties. Indeed, in more recent years, they have provided an almost endless resource of ridicule for the angry video game nerd on YouTube. However, over on the NES's handheld sibling, LJN managed to redeem themselves somewhat with amazing titles such as this. By the time this game came out, there had already been a ton of different games based on the exploits of one Peter Parker, but in my mind this was one of the first to truly represent the superhero properly. Surprise surprise, the game revolves around the kidnap of Spidey's long-term girlfriend Mary Jane, and you need to swing out into the city to rescue her. There are 5 levels in total that cleverly combine the best parts of a scrolling beat-em-up and an arcade adventure. Spidey can choose to use his fists and feet to defeat the bad guys in his way, or get clever by slinging webs to avoid attacks, reach different areas and take down the foes. There are also sections where you have to climb a skyscraper and avoid falling objects, not unlike the original Spider-Man game that appeared on the Atari 2600, which is a very nice touch. The graphics stay authentic to the comics too, and the audio is also excellent. A must-have Marvel masterpiece. There are a lot of classic arcade games that have been ported over to the Game Boy in greatly enhanced form. But one of the best is undoubtedly this version of Data East's hugely popular 1982 platform game, Burger Time. In this case we don't just get a port of the original arcade game, oh no siree. We also get a spanking deluxe version of the game too. The basic gameplay is exactly the same as the original coin-op. You play as Chef Peter Pepper and must wake his way around the screen trying to build the burgers. You do this by walking over the different parts, bun, meat, lettuce, etc., until they all drop to the bottom. but trying to stop you are Mr. Egg, Mr. Pickle and Mr. Hot Dog. One touch from these guys and you lose a life. Thankfully, Peter is armed with a very limited amount of pepper spray that stuns them for a short time, allowing you to get past. This deluxe version basically adds loads of new levels that make this already brilliant game better than ever before. The levels also scroll now, mostly due to the small screen, rather than being on a single screen like the arcade game. The difficulty is pitched just right and the gameplay is seriously addictive too. The cute graphics and excellent music also add to the overall enjoyment and impressive all-round experience. I would actually argue that this is one of the very best Game Boy games out there, full stop. Irem's 1984 arcade classic Kung Fu Master was in fact the very first scrolling beat 'em up ever. It started a whole new genre of its own that led on to games like Double Dragon, Final Fight and Streets of Rage being created. For this reason it deserves a special place in video game history. Thankfully it's also a rather good game too. In it you had to make your way through the various floors of a building in order to defeat Mr. X and rescue your girlfriend. Along the way you have to dispatch all sorts of enemies including ninjas, knife throwers and even fire breathing dragons. This Game Boy version is actually more of a sequel than a straight conversion of the original arcade game. The basic structure is exactly the same, making your way through the levels, duffing up the bad guys, but there are plenty of new additions too. Levels now take place in a vast selection of different locations, including a warehouse, dockyard and even on top of a moving train. There are also some pretty nasty end of level bosses to contend with too, adding even more variety. Kung Fu Master still isn't the most advanced beat 'em up out there, but I found this Game Boy version very enjoyable indeed. The graphics are nicely drawn and the big sprites help to add clarity. The music is very reminiscent of the arcade original too, which is nice. Overall this is a very worthy title for the Game Boy. Not many people out there seem to be aware that the Wave Race franchise had such humble beginnings. Most people think of Wave Race 64 being the first. Unlike the following games, his original title in the series is a top-down racer, very much in the style of Micro Machines. In fact, it's almost an exact copy of the water stages from Codemaster's title. It's unusual to see Nintendo copy somebody else's game in fact. In total there are an impressive 16 courses to race around that includes ramps, buoys, whirlpools and other hazards that need to be avoided. There are also power-ups that can be collected as you race to improve your speed and handling. There are different classes of jet skis within the game that you have to work through before you can win the championship. Another great feature of Wave Race is that it can be used with the 4-player link-up box that was first created for the equally excellent F1 race. You must also attempt to complete each course within the time limit allocated. Produced by Shigeru Miyamoto, Wave Race is a hugely fun and exhilarating game. Graphically it's nothing special but keeps blur to a minimum and is nicely presented. Audio is also good without being anything special, and so no complaints here either. There aren't that many top-down racings on the Game Boy, so Wave Race is a very welcome addition to any collection and a hugely enjoyable game to boot. Game Boy version of Don Bluth's Laserdisc classic was titled Dragon's Lair The Legend, to help distinguish it from its more well-known arcade game counterpart. A bit like the later NES and SNES offerings, the programmers opted for a more straightforward platform romp, rather than a frustrating QuickTime event compilation. However, not many people realise that the game itself is actually a port of the ZX Spectrum title Roller Coaster, with some adapted sprites and backgrounds, completely new audio and some minor gameplay tweaks. My younger brother owned an original copy of this cart as a kid and described it as the most frustratingly addictive game he had ever played. So much so in fact that he had bite marks on the casing of his original Game Boy from playing it. Nowadays you'd probably call it the platform equivalent of Dark Souls. I'm not saying that negatively though. The graphics are brilliantly designed and as equally challenging today as they were back then. It's not just the gameplay that impresses however, as Dragon's Lair has some of the best graphics you'll see on a portable. A few years back my brother purchased a Game Boy Light to relive his nostalgia, and this was one of the first games he purchased. Such was his memories of it, and I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear that his new unit is completely bite mark free. Well, at the moment anyway. To say I was a huge fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles back in the day would be a gross understatement. I was absolutely obsessed with them for a while, as were most of my friends. So when my then best friend bought himself a Game Boy, the very first game he purchased was this one. I remember expecting something quite similar to the existing NES offering, but what I found was something that might have looked somewhat reminiscent, but played quite differently. Fall of the Foot Clan was more of a scrolling beat 'em up than anything else, and a hell of a lot more forgiving than its console counterpart. So it's a case of fighting your way through the city, defeating the Foot Clan minions, taking out the bosses, and ultimately rescuing your friend April from the clutches of Krang and Shredder. Aside from the standard size scrolling levels, there are also mini games you can take part in to try and regain your health. Rather than having lives, you can switch between the four turtles when needed, they all play pretty much the same. The graphics are big and bold on the small screen and they look really good, with a range of great music inspired by the iconic theme tune of the cartoon series accompanying the action. Okay, so it's a little on the easy side, especially for experienced gamers, but the excellent execution of the subject matter and pure unadulterated nostalgia pulls this one across the line. Developed by the ever excellent Rare and published by the now defunct French outfit Titus, Monster Max is an isometric adventure game that owes a great deal to Sinclair's ZX Spectrum classics like Night Law, Alien 8 and Head Over Heels. This probably won't come as much of a surprise to those of you who know that the first of those titles were produced by Ultimate Play the Game, who later became Rare, and the latter title was created for Ocean Software by Bernie Drummond and John Rittman, who created this game. The visual style here is very unique for the Game Boy, as are many other features. Cut between the screens are TV monitor style interference effects, sprites are smoothly animated, and the level layouts are very detailed but easy to view. The soundtrack is superbly composed and varies nicely across the different levels. Monster Max isn't an easy game. Even in the opening levels you are presented with brain-teasing puzzles that require various items and power-ups to overcome. These can involve changing your boots to spring over obstacles, using mines to block enemies, and a duck that allows you to duck. This game is very deep and challenging, but also ultimately very rewarding, if you are willing to put the hours in. Monster Max is probably the most unique game found on this list, and has become one of the most sought after hidden gems for the system. Despite being a game that looks very basic on first glances, Solar Striker is a perfectly crafted vertical space shooter, which makes good use of the Game Boy's graphical limitations. The impressive design of the game probably shouldn't come as a surprise when you learn that the man responsible for producing it was none other than Gunpei Yokoi, creator of the Game & Watch concept and indeed the Game Boy itself. You are in control of an advanced and powerful fighter ship called the Solar Striker, and it's your mission to attack and destroy the Reticulon base before they attack Earth itself. There are 6 vertically scrolling stages that you must progress through in order to destroy the Reticulon once and for all. The action gets deceptively harder as you progress through the game, with a large boss to defeat at the end of each stage. Simple mechanics and solid controls ensure the gameplay experience is enjoyable throughout, without ever getting too frustrating. The game's developers, Minakuchi Engineering, sensibly offered for a clear background, so the sprites and bullets are always easy to see, even when there are loads of enemies on screen. An amazingly catchy soundtrack interlaces each level, which adds further to the game's undoubted charm. Solar Striker might be one of the earlier shoot-'em-ups produced for the Game Boy, but it's also one of the very best too. Known as Shadow Warriors in the UK like the alternative versions, Ninja Gaiden Shadow is actually a prequel to the ultra-hard NES classic, rather than a conversion of the excellent Tecmo arcade game. The game opens up with a fantastically animated sequence setting up the story and introducing us to our hero, the one and only Ryu Hayabusa. First of all, you'll be pleased to hear that the difficulty curve is set slightly lower than its NES counterparts. You can take a slow and steady approach here too, to ensure your movements and attacks are well timed, rather than the non-stop pace of its sibling. The graphical style is quite similar to the NES games, which is certainly no bad thing, and matches the Game Boy's limited visual capabilities pretty well. For example, the backgrounds look slightly faded to help the well-animated sprites stand out better. The gameplay mechanics are pretty tight, allowing you to perform classic jump and slash movements with ease. The enemies are pretty varied, and understanding their attack styles becomes key to ensuring you escape each counter unscathed, especially during those epic boss fights. If you enjoyed the Ninja Gaiden trilogy on the NES, then you're going to absolutely love this original and exclusive Game Boy iteration too. You might also be interested to know that the game got a homebrew port to the ZX Spectrum in more recent years. This side-scrolling motorcycle-based racing game, developed by Konami and published on their North American Ultra Games label, is very much a precursor to the hugely popular Trials series, which will be more familiar to modern gamers. Competing against a time limit, you need to race through each level using the various ramps and jumps that make up each course. The angle of the bike needs to be controlled to land jumps perfectly and correct your position for the next part. The controls might seem a little difficult at first, but once you begin to understand how they work, they become second nature. Using your limited nitros at the right time to boost across gaps also becomes an important trick to master. Despite the simple visuals, the levels are extremely well designed and really challenge your brain too, as you try to work out how to traverse certain stages and sections of the track successfully. There is some classic Konami music overlaid with decent sound effects that recreate the noisy motorbike sounds pretty well. Motocross Maniacs might look like a fast action arcade affair, but this is the game where timing is everything, so it takes a lot longer to master than you'd originally envisage. This last ability is also increased by the 3 different play modes too: 1 player solo mode, 1 player against the computer, or a fiercely competitive 2-player link-up game.
So let's do it.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing exclusives for the Nintendo Game Boy. Can you think of any other exclusives for this classic handheld that should have made the list? Or do you think some of these games were unworthy of inclusion? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Mitchell Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Aussie B, Noel Saw, Dos Gamerman and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to a host of extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.